What's going on? We're back here today with another fantasy football video, continuing our week 2 rankings. Today we're going to be talking about the wide receivers. Before we get into the video, please do leave a like, comment, subscribe, especially if this video helped you out. So getting into it, let's start with the wide receivers. Again, we're going to do it just like last time, talk about the rankings standard form, and then kind of talk about the differences I have in half PPR and PPR. So number 1 wide receiver this week, I have Cooper Kupp. It's Cooper Kupp, what can you say? Monster target share, gets a lot of yards, good for a touchdown almost every game. I don't think he's going to win the Triple Crown again this year. I think Justin Jefferson has a real shot of being a number 1 wide receiver this year. But I like the matchup for Cooper Kupp this week against Atlanta. They got torched by Michael Thomas last week for 2 touchdowns. So I think Cooper Kupp has a good shot of really getting in the end zone, maybe even more than once this week. Justin Jefferson, dog last week, the number 1 wide receiver, number 1 scorer in all of fantasy. Justin Jefferson dropped 30 standard fantasy points. In PPR, it was closer to 40, which is pretty good. And it's crazy because he had 33 PPR points at halftime. So he could have had a monster game if Minnesota wasn't really running away with it. It just really goes to show when Justin Jefferson's hot, he can really start getting it going. And Minnesota really feeds him when he is hot. So Justin Jefferson's what you want in a number 1 wide receiver, crazy good wide out, and gets a lot of receptions as well to add on to that. So he's not like just a boomer bust play. He really does it all. Jamar Chase at number 3. He really benefits from T. Higgins being out, but I think as of this recording, T. Higgins is expected to play. I think he practiced. He didn't clear the concussion protocols yet. I think he did like light practice or something like that. So, but regardless if T. Higgins does play or not, Jamar Chase is going to be a top 5 wide receiver week in and week out. Against Dallas, I expect the Bengals to really get going against them offensively, especially since the Bengals came out to a rough start against Pittsburgh last week. I think the Bengals are gonna want to get going early this week. Davante Adams at number 4, a huge target monster. He always gets a lot of target, whether it's on the Raiders or the Packers. I think last week he had 17 targets when they were down. Derek Carr is really going to force the ball to him just like Aaron Rodgers did when they really need to catch up. And I think Davante Adams is probably one of the best wide receivers in terms of skill. So he's going to get his no matter what. I think he's locked in at a top 5 wide receiver this week. And Stephon Diggs as well. With Cole Beasley gone, Stephon Diggs expects to get a lot more of those shorter routes as well. He did get a lot last year as well. But this year, especially with Beasley gone, Gabriel Davis being a great wideout, I think Stephon Diggs is really going to dominate that short, medium, and even some deep ball routes. So Stephon Diggs is definitely a weekly must-play guy. Moving on to A.J. Brown, he really showed that he's going to be a huge part of the offense last week. Jalen Hurts went to him often. He didn't get the touchdown though, but he did get a lot of yards. He racked up 155 yards, I believe, and that's really good, especially in a run-dominant team. A.J. Brown was on the Titans before, so he's used to this heavy run offense. And he still somehow gets his, and he's like, last year even, I think ever since he got drafted, he's like one of the top 3, top 5 wide receivers in terms of scoring since he got drafted. So A.J. Brown is definitely an elite wide receiver. Jalen Hurts is going to look to him often, and I don't expect that to change even against the Vikings, especially if Philly does end up going down. Deebo Samuel at number 7. I have him a little bit higher here on standard leagues just because of his rushing prowess. Elijah Mitchell is going to be out for 2 months, which means San Francisco is going to have to look elsewhere. Jeff Wilson Jr. is a reliable backup, but Deebo Samuel had one of the best fantasy seasons ever last year and still got overshadowed by Cooper Kupp, but that was mostly because of Deebo Samuel's ability to get rushing touchdowns. He got so many last year, and I expect San Francisco to kind of lean a little bit more on him to get a couple more rushes this week. Well, especially while Elijah Mitchell is out, I expect Deebo Samuel to get a couple more rushing attempts. Michael Pittman Jr., I think he's going to be an absolute monster this year. I can see him having overall a better, kind of maybe sneaky into the top 5. It's going to be hard to kind of take one of the slots from Diggs or Adams and Chase by the end of the year. I don't think he beats out Cooper Kupp or Justin Jefferson, but I could easily see him somehow sneaking into top 5, if not 5, top 7 wide receiver this year. Just because of his target share with Matt Ryan, obviously really likes throwing to him. He's a big guy. He can run the short route. Really good on these out of the slot like Keenan Allen. Really has all the intangibles you want in a wide receiver. He can get those jump balls. He can work out of the slot. And with Jonathan Taylor getting a bulk load of the rushing offense, they're always going to be in a good position where Michael Pittman can hopefully get some touchdowns. Obviously, the yards and receptions will be there. He's definitely more valuable in PPR leagues where I think I have him at 6, but we'll get into that a little bit later on. Mike Evans, Chris Godwin's out for the foreseeable future, probably a couple of weeks. And Tampa Bay is really going to rely on Mike Evans in the red zone, especially. He's always been a huge red zone target for Tom Brady. Leonard Fournette's going to get a lot of work this week as well. Julio Jones is going to step up along with Russell Gage while Godwin is out. And Mike Evans is clearly their guy. They're going to go to him a lot, especially when if the game is ever on the line. Tom Brady loves going to Mike Evans. So he's a solid play this week, especially in standard leagues. Moving on to Tyreek Hill, another receiver on a new team. Tyreek Hill had a pretty solid outing last week against the Patriots. He did get in the end zone for a touchdown. But I am a little bit more worried about him this week. Obviously, he's going to either get shadowed by Marlon Humphrey or double teamed by the Baltimore defense. The defense is pretty good for Baltimore, but Tyreek Hill is Tyreek Hill, one of the fastest players in the NFL. So he always has potential every week to become a huge boom player, always with the possibility of getting in the top 5 scoring for that week. This week I do have him at 10 just because I do like these guys a little bit better, obviously. Moving on to CD Lamb at 12. Mike Williams at 11. This one I am a little concerned about just because Mike Williams had 1 fantasy point last week in standard leagues, and this is really because of Keenan Allen's injury. Keenan Allen gets a lot of targets. He has the hamstring injury, so he's not going to be playing. A lot of those receptions are going to have to go elsewhere, and Mike Williams is most likely going to be that guy. The Chargers could also lean on Austin Eckler to get a little bit more checkdowns, a little bit more being used a little bit more as a receiver. But playing against Kansas City, we saw last week Mahomes, he came out swinging. If he does that again and the Chargers end up going down, the Chargers are going to rely heavily in the passing game. And that's where Mike Williams is really going to have to step up. Yeah, they can go to players like Joshua Palmer, but Mike Williams gives them that offensive firepower, and he's a crazy deep threat. So I expect Herbert to look Mike Williams away a lot this week. Moving on to CD Lamb, who I am concerned about. I have him a little bit lower just because of Dak being injured. But there's news I saw that Dak might only miss 4 to 6 weeks instead of the 8-9 week timetable they gave originally. So that's really good for CD Lamb owners. I'm still worried about him, all Dallas players though, at least until Dak comes back. But one bright side in CD Lamb's miserable game last week was that he had 11 targets. So the targets are going to be there for CD, especially with the backup quarterback. He may either rely heavily on the run or rely heavily on CD Lamb and Dalton Schultz. And I believe that would have been the same game plan if Dak Prescott was in the game. It's just now you're having a worse quarterback throw to CD Lamb, throw to Dalton Schultz, hand the ball off to Zeke. So Dallas, you're going to really have to watch out for this game. I do have CD Lamb a little bit higher than most just because of that target share potential. And if the backup QB does really go his way often and CD Lamb actually converts, because he only had 2 catches last week out of his 11 targets, CD Lamb could be in line for a good week. I would actually consider him kind of a buy low player just because after his miserable week 1, Dak Prescott being injured, it's not really looking good for CD Lamb right now. It could be a nice time to swoop in and kind of trade for him because by the end of the year when Dak does come back, I do expect CeeDee Lamb to have a great season. Moving on to Buffalo's number 2 wide receiver, Gabriel Davis. Had a touchdown last week, the first touchdown of the NFL season. I expect Gabriel Davis to be involved offensively. Josh Allen loves airing the ball out, and Gabriel Davis is that huge deep threat that really benefits from Josh Allen's arm. Obviously, Diggs is going to be here, so Gabriel Davis might not always be a top scorer week in and week out, but if he can manage to be a nice little wide receiver 2 complement next to Diggs, which everyone expects him to be this year, I really think Gabriel Davis can find himself a home in the 12 to 17 range of the weekly rankings, depending on matchups, obviously. Amon-Ra St. Brown, I love him this week, especially against Washington. He's going to be a huge target for Jared Goff, and clearly Goff leaned on him last game a lot, along with the running backs DeAndre Swift and Jamal Williams. But Amon-Ra St. Brown is going to be Goff's go-to target as a receiver. There is Hawkinson. The running backs can get some pass-catching targets, but Amon-Ra St. Brown last week got a touchdown, got I think 11 or 12 targets, brought in six of them, I believe. So he's gonna get his share, and I really think he's off to a good start for his little breakout campaign. Moving on to DJ Moore, who had a disappointing week last week, and I expect him to bounce back. Carolina really just had an awful first half last week. They couldn't get anything going. McCaffrey only had 5 touches in the first half. DJ Moore really, I think, only had 1 rush attempt in the first half. They really couldn't get to him. So I expect Carolina to really take advantage of CMC this week and DJ Moore, their 2 best players offensively. So especially if they want to win, they're playing the Giants this week, who do have a better defense. But if Carolina really wants to compete, which they probably do after trading for Baker, they're really going to have to step up and throw to their skill position guys, DJ Moore and Christian McCaffrey. Moving on to number 16, Terry McLaurin. I have him a little bit higher up than most people, just because Terry McLaurin is a great wide receiver, and even though he only had 2 catches last week, he did have the touchdown. He caught one huge bomb, so McLaurin's always good for that. Out of nowhere, he'll get one huge passing play where he just racks up most of his yards. But he's a good receiver overall, and he's done good with bad quarterbacks. Like Carson Wentz is the best quarterback McLaurin's had so far in his career, and McLaurin always was able to produce. So I don't see a difference this year for McLaurin, although he does have competition with Curtis Samuel and Jahan Dotson. So Samuel got 11 targets. Meanwhile, Terry McLaurin only had 4. Obviously, if you're a Terry McLaurin owner, you're very worried about the targets that he had. Just because if Curtis Samuel is getting 11, Jahan Dotson's getting 5, Logan Thomas is also being featured in the offense. If Terry McLaurin really just becomes only a deep option for Carson Wentz, it's a huge problem for his fantasy value. He's going to jump into that boom or bust kind of range. I don't think that will be the case. I think maybe last week they just game planned to get Terry McLaurin a little bit less involved. The defense game planned against Terry McLaurin. But yeah, Curtis Samuel, 11 receptions, popular waiver wire pickup this week. 11 targets, sorry. Popular waiver wire addition this week, along with Jahan Dotson, who had 2 touchdowns in his debut game in the NFL. And he had 3 receptions, but 2 touchdowns. Clearly shows Carson Wentz won't shy away from going to Jahan Dotson in crunch time, basically. And he's their first-round rookie. I think the number 1 wide receiver off the board this year. So Washington is definitely going to try to feature Jahan Dotson more and more as the season progresses. So Terry McLaurin owners could be a little bit concerned, but I wouldn't be super concerned as of right now. Marquise Brown, he's going to have a good season. As long as DeAndre Hopkins is out, Marquise Brown is going to be their number 1 option. I have him at number 17, which I think is pretty safe. He can easily move on up to the top 12. But I saw last week, I think his name is Deutsch. Let me just double check that really quick. Yeah, so Greg Dortch, he was pretty active in the offense. 7 receptions, 63 yards, while Marquise Brown only had 4 receptions. So Brown and Dortch could combine that 1 and 2 punch. I believe Dortch really gains a lot of value with Hopkins being out, gives them another receiver, take a little bit of pressure off of Marquise Brown. But Hollywood Brown, he's always been a vertical threat. He's going to continue to do so within the Kyler Murray offense. And the Cardinals don't look that good. Obviously, it's just 1 week in. They got destroyed by Kansas City. But if they kind of fall behind against the Raiders as well, obviously Kyler Murray is going to have to air it out, and Marquise Brown benefits from that the most. Brandon Cooks at number 18. I actually think Brandon Cooks is super underrated just because I feel like he doesn't have that name value. So people are always like, Brandon Cooks not that great, but he constantly produces top 10, top 15 wide receiver years. Ever since he was on the Rams, ever since he moved to the Houston Texans, he's been sneaky good. And I don't think that has changed so far with Davis Mills under center. Clearly Cooks was his favorite target, and clearly he's going to rely on him a lot throughout the year. So Cooks easily in a PPR league obviously will gain more value just because of his reception, just because of the amount of receptions he's going to grab weekly. But he's a sneaky play. He could easily move up the rankings as the season progresses. Moving on to Courtland Sutton at number 19. I am a little worried if I'm Courtland Sutton owners this week. Jerry Jeudy obviously got a huge touchdown last week. He had 100 yards and a touchdown last week. Courtland Sutton, meanwhile, wasn't that involved. He had 72 yards. And Russell Wilson didn't even look toward any receiver until that Jerry Jeudy touchdown. So he mainly played through his running backs and tight ends. So I'd be a little bit worried if I was Courtland Sutton owners. I think as the year progresses, Courtland Sutton will be the number 1 wide receiver for Denver. Jerry Jeudy, he's solid. I think I have Jeudy. Where is Jeudy? Not that much lower. Yeah, I have Jeudy at 22. So they're not that far apart. I still expect Courtland Sutton to just kind of inch out Jeudy. But I think they both could be reliable fantasy options this year. Jalen Waddle, number 2 guy behind Tyreek Hill. If Tyreek Hill does get shadowed by Marlon Humphrey, Tua might not throw his way and kind of focus in on Waddle a little bit more. So that's kind of what you're hoping happens this week, as if Jalen Waddle is getting more and more targets, he's going to produce. So last week he wasn't bad. He got the touchdown while Tyreek Hill did not. So this week I do expect Jalen Waddle to be featured a little bit more in the offense. I think he only had 4 receptions last week. If he can improve on that amount, he's going to have a good week too. Moving on to Deontay Johnson. Another wide receiver that was kind of disappointing last week. Only had 5.5 standard fantasy points and didn't really do much else in PPR leagues as well. Pittsburgh had the benefit of going up really big against the Bengals last week. This week they face definitely a more underwhelming offense in New England. Mac Jones might not even play, so that's also another thing to look out for. If Pittsburgh does go up a lot, they may lean a little bit more on the run game. Last week, Pittsburgh really didn't get the ball on offense as much. Well, actually, that's not true. They just scored in so many different ways that Deontay Johnson really never got the opportunity to get going. This week, especially if Najee Harris doesn't play, I think he is on track to play. So if he doesn't, Deontay Johnson is going to be a huge part of their offense. They're going to need to get yards somehow, and Deontay Johnson is their best playmaker. So I feel like Pittsburgh would go to him a lot. Moving on to Michael Thomas. He had a pretty good game week 1. 2 touchdowns, scored 17 standard fantasy points. I think 22 in PPR leagues. He had a really good game, especially when Jameis Winston was trying to mount that comeback against the Falcons. He leaned heavily on Michael Thomas, especially in the red zone. Jarvis Landry, who I have at 37, was clearly Jameis Winston's more preferred target. Getting down the field, I think he had 114 yards and a lot of receptions. So I think he had 11 targets, 7 receptions. So Jarvis Landry is definitely his favorite target to go down the field with, but Michael Thomas is going to always be that red zone target for Jameis Winston. Michael Thomas can easily play himself into top 10 fantasy wide receiver this year. A lot of people are a little bit more hesitant just because of his injury concerns. But so far in the year, even though he did start off the year a little bit hobbled, was on the injury report, he did perform. So Michael Thomas, you can expect him to jump in a lot of fantasy rankings if he does end up having another solid game. DK Metcalf, on the other hand, I'm not so high on this year. 1.6 fantasy points. Pretty disappointing when you consider the talent that DK Metcalf has. With Geno Smith under center, you don't expect Seattle to throw the ball a lot, which they did actually throw the ball a good amount, and Geno did look good in their Week 1 win against Denver. But DK, he really got nothing going. He fumbled the ball. He did have a lot of receptions, which made up for his lackluster scoring in PPR leagues. But in standard leagues, DK Metcalf kind of left you desiring a little bit more. He never really got any deep routes going. He was used more in the short game. I think he totaled 36 or 38 yards. So DK he didn't have a DK-like performance, basically. We're going to need a little bit more targets for him. And Tyler Lockett as well, who I have at 38. He had only 2.8 fantasy points. So the wide receivers really didn't get a chance to get going against the Broncos. This week they play San Francisco, which is another tough defense. But Geno Smith seemed to rely heavily on Rashad Penny in the run game. He relied heavily on all of his tight ends. The tight ends accounting for all of the touchdowns in the game. So if DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett, they really want to maintain their fantasy value, they're going to have to get more involved in the offense. I expect both to be featured a little bit more this week. However, I am a little bit hesitant to start either one this week. Rashad Bateman at number 25 against the Miami Dolphins this week. He caught one huge bomb from Lamar Jackson last week against the Jets. And he is positioned to be the number 1 wide receiver for the Ravens. But he was actually overshadowed last week by... I actually don't even have him ranked. By Duvernay, which kind of I'd have him I guess right outside of the top 50. But yeah, Duvernay, he was a kick returner last year, Pro Bowl kick returner, I believe. So he's trying to show that he's more than just that, can be that deep threat that Hollywood Brown was last year for the Ravens. And if Duvernay can do that and consistently gets a lot of yardage down the field, he might become one of Lamar Jackson's favorite targets, especially seeing that he already got 2 touchdowns to his name this season. But Rashad Bateman, solid player, got his touchdown last week, got a lot of yards. I do expect a better game from Mark Andrews, who was pretty disappointing last week. So Bateman's upside might be limited by that, because if Mark Andrews gets going this week, Lamar might try to get him more involved. There's also the eventual return of J.K. Dobbins. Baltimore right now, their running game looked awful last week, even against the Jets. So this week, I expect if J.K. Dobbins does return, they're going to kind of work toward establishing that running game again. Baltimore is always going to run the ball. Lamar Jackson, J.K. Dobbins, Gus Edwards, Kenyon Drake, whoever's there, they're going to focus in on that run game in Baltimore and really get working on the play action. And that's when they're going to get Rashad Bateman, Mark Andrews, Duvernay really involved. Elijah Moore at number 26. I really like Elijah Moore this year. I don't know if he can break out into a superstar wide receiver, kind of in the top 15, top 12 range. But I can easily see him sneaking in the top 20 this year, just because the Jets really don't have many offensive weapons outside of Elijah Moore, Breece Hall, and Michael Carter. Both of the running backs who are great pass catchers, both of them in their own right. But Elijah Moore is that wide receiver 1 for the Jets. Going to get a lot of targets, especially if the Jets are down a lot, which they probably likely will be most games. But they face a tough Cleveland defense this week. Elijah Moore only did put up 4.9 points last week. But he ended the season off on a huge bang last season. And I kind of expect Elijah Moore to kind of try to replicate those numbers. Obviously, it probably won't be doable. But if he can get anywhere near the amount of target share that he received at the end of last year, Elijah Moore has a real threat of kind of sneaking into the top 20-25 wide receivers for the year. Moving on to T. Higgins against Dallas. He's still in that concussion protocol. We talked about this a little bit earlier. If he does end up playing, he's going to be ranked higher than 27. Probably can see him easily getting into the top 15. But just because of the chance he doesn't play, I have him ranked a little bit lower here. Solid wide receiver 2 behind Jamar Chase. With all the attention that Chase is going to bring in, T. Higgins is going to get a lot of opportunities for receptions, and that's where he's really going to be able to thrive. Last week was a little bit disappointing, but he did get off to a pretty good start before leaving with the concussion. So expect T. Higgins to bounce back the next time he plays, whether it be this week or in the future. Juju Smith-Schuster, I would say, is Kansas City's number 1 wide receiver. I know Pat Mahomes is saying they're not going to have a wide receiver 1 this year. In terms of fantasy, they probably won't deliver wide receiver 1 performance, but Juju Smith-Schuster should be a reliable target for Patrick Mahomes, especially if he can get going out of the slot. I feel like that's where Juju does the best. Slot and kind of lining up out wide for the deep plays, the vertical plays. But Kansas City has a lot of vertical options, so they really need more of a slot guy, and that's where I think Juju could really thrive, kind of similar to his time early on with Pittsburgh. But yeah, Juju's more of a wait-and-see approach. I think he's in line for a good season. If you're a Patrick Mahomes' number 1 target any year in fantasy, you're going to be a reliable wide receiver to play. Moving on to Allen Robinson. I have him ranked at 29, but he had an absolutely miserable performance last week. 1 catch, only for 12 yards, and he was brought in to be that second guy behind Cooper Kupp. Allen Robinson's a great player. I think he's a very underrated wide receiver, delivers tons of underrated fantasy seasons, even underrated regular NFL seasons, where he grabs a lot of touchdowns. I believe there was a year where he led the NFL in touchdowns when he was in Jacksonville. But yeah, Allen Robinson brought in to be that guy behind Cooper Kupp. Didn't really get to showcase that last time around, but the Rams were looking pretty miserable on offense. The only bright side was Cooper Kupp. If Allen Robinson can get a little bit more involved, get about 4 or 5 catches a game, maybe sneak in a touchdown, Allen Robinson can really show some value as a wide receiver too. Moving on to Christian Kirk, the number 1 wide receiver for the Jaguars. He finally gets his time to shine as a wide receiver 1, and he did amazing. 117 yards last week, putting up 11 points in standard leagues, and he's really going to be able to take the reins of wide receiver this year. Jacksonville has a lot of weapons. They have Kirk, they have Evan Ingram, obviously James Robinson, who did well last week. There's also Travis Etienne, who's going to be pretty dynamic in their offense. So Jacksonville does have a lot more weapons than they did last year. So I expect them to be a lot better offensively. However, they're playing a tough Indianapolis Colts defense. I mean, they did get burned by Houston last week, so Jacksonville maybe could put up a couple points on them. But Trevor Lawrence should be more comfortable this year on offense just because of all the weapons he has. So the more comfortable Trevor Lawrence gets and that connection he builds with Christian Kirk, it's really only a boost to Kirk's value. Darnell Mooney at 31. I actually like Mooney a lot. Obviously, he had a very miserable performance last week, 1 catch for 8 yards. But I feel like that game should really be discredited because the rain last week in the Chicago-San Francisco game was absolutely insane. The Chicago Bears, I think, only threw it 7 times in total that game. So that's kind of a one-off performance. Mooney is going to be the wide receiver 1 for the Bears. And Justin Fields is a pretty good quarterback. Obviously, he's more mobile than a throwing quarterback. But being the wide receiver 1 in any offense kind of garners you a little bit of respect in fantasy. If Mooney can become a little bit of a deep threat or catch more balls for the Bears, he's going to have a bigger role in the offense. And I think he can kind of sneak up out of the top into the top 25 as well if he ends up really proving his worth with the Bears. Moving on to Adam Thielen at number 32. Another wide receiver too had a disappointing week 1, playing behind Justin Jefferson, where when he got going, no one else really was able to see the ball. But Adam Thielen makes a nice compliment to Justin Jefferson, kind of like the year Adam Thielen broke out, where Diggs was really that wide receiver 1, huge vertical threat, huge playmaking ability, and then Adam Thielen kind of snuck in and became that slot receiver that got so many receptions, that did all of the grunt work, got those 7-yard gains, those 8-yard gains. So if Adam Thielen can kind of return to that, I know he was injured last year and is still probably returning to form, but if he could become that nice compliment to Justin Jefferson, especially with Jefferson drawing so much attention, Adam Thielen can kind of have that bounce back year we all expect him to. Moving on to Drake London at 33. He was clearly Mariota's favorite target. Kyle Pitts really had a disappointing week last week, and I don't expect that to always be the case. But Mariota showed confidence in throwing to London, and I expect that trend to continue as the year progresses. The more comfortable he does get with Mariota, the better it is for his fantasy outlook. Rookie receivers, they tend to start off the year on a they usually have rough starts to the year just because they're facing NFL cornerbacks now instead of college cornerbacks, and can't really abuse the NFL ones like the college ones. But they really hit their stride later on into the season around week 7, 8. Then the second half of the season, the wide receivers usually end up being steals. So Drake London has a lot of season-long potential. On a weekly basis, I still have him a little bit lower, but easily if he does break out later on in the year, he can also sneak into the top 25, top 30 as a reliable weekly option. Julio Jones at number 34. Obviously, we talked about this, Godwin being injured. Julio Jones is going to have to step up, and he showed flashes last week of the old Julio Jones. He got out in space, he ran the ball twice, overall putting up 8.6 standard fantasy points. So Julio Jones has potential to kind of become what he once was, and I like Julio Jones as a player, so it's kind of great to see him return to that kind of form, and I'm really hoping he does dominate this week or this season really, and really show that he got it. Brandon Ayuk at number 35. Many really expect him to break out this year, playing across Deebo Samuel. Obviously, the game was just miserable last week, so I'll kind of discredit his fantasy points for that. But he's a reliable number 2 option behind Deebo Samuel, especially if they use Samuel more as a rushing wide receiver. Brandon Ayuk can really take advantage of the targets available for him. Moving on to number 36, Amari Cooper. I actually am very down on Amari Cooper. I have him here just because Cleveland really got away from the passing game last week and really ground and pounded the ball with Nick Chubb. But Cooper is their wide receiver 1, even though Donovan Peoples-Jones, who I don't have ranked here, was the primary target for Jacoby Brissett. I feel like they're going to get Cooper the ball much more often this week. He only had 17 yards last week, and that just can't stand if this is one of the guys you traded for. So obviously he's going to be a big piece to the offense. I don't like the fit as much. Cooper is a great route runner, great receiver, great deep threat out wide. But with Jacoby Brissett kind of focusing more on short to medium passes, Amari Cooper's value might be capped. It'll be interesting to see how he's used this week. If he's used sparingly again this week and Donovan Peoples-Jones gets a lot more targets, Amari Cooper might fall even more in the rankings, probably down to the 40s, maybe even off the top 50. And Peoples-Jones might sneak in the top 50. Jarvis Landry, we talked about. Tyler Lockett as well. Hunter Renfrow, this is another one. I'm a little down on Renfrow this year. Obviously, he's a slot guy with the Raiders, playing next to Devontae Adams and Darren Waller. He will see he won't see as many targets, but he will be able to be that reliable slot guy for them. The thing is, Renfrow really got going last year, but now, like we said, Devontae Adams got 17 targets last week. So those targets aren't there at all for Renfrow. And he's not a huge big play kind of guy. Renfrow is like that Adam Thielen, get into that 7 yard, 8 yards, and that's like his comfort zone. But if the Raiders lean heavily on their deep playability with Darren Waller, with Devontae Adams, it's going to be hard for Renfrow to replicate what he did last year. I'm a little bit down on him. Obviously, he's going to see much softer coverages now that he's the wide receiver 2 playing behind Devontae Adams, who's probably going to be double teamed the entire game. Darren Waller, who's also going to draw some attention. So Renfrow might be able to have sneaky fantasy weeks, but I don't see him doing as good as he did last year. At number 40, we have Devonta Smith. Had put up a donut last week, and you just can't do that as your number 2 wide receiver on a team. Obviously, A.J. Brown absolutely dogged, so Philly still somehow won, but they definitely need to get Devonta Smith a little bit more involved offensively. Philly is that, again, a ground and pound, run the ball, run heavy, focused team, with last week scoring 4 touchdowns on the ground by 4 different players. So I'm a little bit worried about Devonta Smith. Can easily see him falling out of the top 50 soon, but this week I'm going to give him another shot and kind of reevaluate him from there. Robert Woods, another wide receiver I'm very hesitant in starting. He clearly only had he only had 13 yards, but he clearly wasn't the guy for Tennessee. Treylon Burks saw a lot of targets. Phillips saw a lot of targets. Phillips, I think, led the team in receptions as well and yards. So the Tennessee pass catchers aren't amazing. Robert Woods was poised to be that wide receiver 1, kind of take over that A.J. Brown role. Obviously not as effective as A.J. Brown, but Robert Woods is really going to have to step it up. Unfortunately, this week for him, they play the Buffalo D, so it might be real tough for Robert Woods to get going in this one as well. He's a really shaky play at this point, but after Buffalo, when they face much softer defenses, Robert Woods can kind of break out. He may be an interesting buy low player, but I wouldn't invest too much in that trade. Chase Claypool at number 42. I have him ranked here just because of the rushing ability for Claypool. I think if Najee Harris doesn't play, there's potential that Claypool gets a lot of carries out of the backfield. Harris is poised to play, so I have him a little bit lower. But if he doesn't end up playing, Claypool could really do some damage on the ground. And being a pretty deep, fast, being a fast wide receiver, being able to run the deep route, Chase Claypool has a little bit of fantasy value. Unfortunately for him, I don't know how much that value is with Trubisky under center. But Claypool can kind of put himself in a niche environment here. Marquez Valdes-Scantling scored a touchdown. No, he didn't score a touchdown. Scored 41 yards last week. Obviously, one of the deep threats for Kansas City, along with Mecole Hardman, Juju Smith-Schuster. And anytime you're in a system with Patrick Mahomes, you're going to be able to put up big points. Scantling is probably a boom or bust player at this point, but I have him ranked a little bit higher because I do see him getting a little bit more involved in the offense this week in what's going to be a more competitive game against the Chargers. Moving on to Tyler Boyd at number 44. He's a little bit higher because of the T. Higgins concussion. If Higgins does play, I personally wouldn't have Tyler Boyd in the top 50. I think he is just outside of that. He's a solid player, big guy, really can take advantage of the size in the red zone. So that's where Boyd might be in position to really take off, especially if Cincinnati can't get going with Joe Mixon in there or Jamar Chase, who they target a lot in the red zone as well. But he's more of a sneaky streamer play, sneaky flex play if T. Higgins is out. At 45, I have Chris Olave with the Saints. Not a bad debut for him, 6.1 fantasy points. But Jarvis Landry and Michael Thomas are clearly the 1 and 2 in no order in New Orleans. And they play a tough Tampa Bay defense, so Olave might have to continue playing third fiddle throughout the year. But like I said, with the rookie wide receivers, they tend to really take off in the second half of the year. John Dotson and Curtis Samuel, 2 very popular pickups this week for Washington. Dotson got 2 touchdowns. Curtis Samuel got a touchdown and led the team in targets and receptions. I would probably play Curtis Samuel in PPR leagues and Jahan Dotson in standard leagues. I think their value can switch, really depending on which kind of league you're in. But they're two players to watch out for. Jahan Dotson, again, rookies later on as the season progresses might be more and more involved in the offense. For now, I think Curtis Samuel is the better play in PPR leagues. DJ Shark Jr., another popular pickup this week, scored a touchdown for the Lions last week, along with Amon-Ra St. Brown, being a nice compliment to him. I think DJ Shark has the potential to be that red zone guy for them. Again, another big body frame that could really take advantage in the red zone. Treylon Burks, the Tennessee rookie, I also have him down here. Pretty solid outing. Again, like I said, outplayed Robert Woods. Only Kyle Phillips played better. I know they want to use Treylon Burks heavily in the offense, so there's potential for him to really take over as the season progresses. As of right now, I wouldn't start him, but I would keep him on my bench and kind of have a wait-and-see approach. Corey Davis wasn't bad for the Jets last week. Now they play Cleveland. If Elijah Moore is really on lock, the Jets might have to look Corey Davis's way a little bit more often. But again, he's not a player I would start week in and week out unless you are in a really deep league. But he has solid fantasy value. So let's talk about the PPR rankings a little bit. Obviously, I still have Cooper Kupp as my number 1. Devontae Adams, number 3. He takes over the Jamar Chase spot. Michael Pittman jumps to 6. I really like him in PPR leagues. AJ Brown as well is up here. And Deebo Samuel, Mike Evans, Tyreek take a little bit of a hit. But CD and Amon-Ra St. Brown, they get a little bit of bump, as well as Brandon Cooks, I believe, gets a big bump here. Mike Williams takes a little bit of a hit just because he's more of a vertical threat. Courtland Sutton outpaces Jerry Jeudy a little bit more in this one, just because Jerry Jeudy is more of a vertical threat. Courtland Sutton will probably get more targets going his way, probably has the ability to rack up more touchdowns. Gabriel Davis also takes a little bit of a fall here. Michael Thomas moves up. Terry McLaurin takes a hit here at number 18. I'm still a little bit worried about McLaurin. I'm still a little bit worried about CD, so these might be optimistic rankings. DJ Moore as well, a little bit worried about. But I can easily see players like DK Metcalf, if he does take off a little bit more this week, outscore some of these players over here. Same thing for Christian Kirk, who had 17 points last week. I think he can really shine if he gets a lot of receptions again this week. But for the most part, I think the rankings are not that different. Curtis Samuel has a big jump here to 42. Drake London as well. Olave and Burks and Shark fall beneath Corey Davis. Let's see, where else? Jalen Waddle is a little bit less valuable in PPR leagues, but if Marlon Humphrey shadows Tyreek Hill and really takes away Tyreek Hill from the game, Jalen Waddle could really thrive and move up in these rankings. Hollywood Brown, vertical threat for Arizona, takes a little bit of a hit. Juju jumps up a little bit just because if he plays out of the slot, I expect him to get a lot of catches. Darnell Mooney also jumps up a little bit here. I expect him to be number 1 wide receiver for Chicago this year and a little bit more involved in the offense as well. Jarvis takes a huge jump here. Hunter Renfrow also takes a little bit of jump here, although I'm still hesitant on Hunter Renfrow. Julio Jones gets a little bit of a jump here as well, just because someone's going to have to take over Godwin's touches, and I think it's Julio Jones. Drake London also gets a little bit of a jump. Let's see, Jahan Dotson is here. Yeah, for the most part, I think it's just obviously the PPR heavy guys like Michael Pittman, St. Brown, CD Lamb, Juju, Landry. They always benefit from extra points off the catches, and I really think that's where they could really prove value in these leagues. Michael Pittman especially, huge target share, had a lot of catches. If he manages 11-12 targets a game, Michael Pittman is going to be in line for a huge year. Same thing with Diggs. Adams, if he manages even above 13 targets a game, he's going to have a crazy year. Brandon Cooks, like I said, sneaky wide receiver play. I really expect him to do well this week against Denver. But I think that's all for this video. Let me know down below, who do you guys think is going to be the #1 wide receiver this week? I got my money on Cooper Kupp over Justin Jefferson, but let me know if you guys think otherwise. And please do leave a like, comment, subscribe, especially if this video helped you out, and I'll see you next time.